The basic social principle of the objectivist ethics is that just as life is an end in itself, so every living human being is an end in him or herself, not the means to the ends or the welfare of others, and therefore that man must live for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others, nor sacrificing others to himself. To live for his own sake means that the achievement of his own happiness is man's highest moral purpose. In psychological terms, the issue of man's survival does not confront his consciousness as an issue of life or death, but an issue of happiness or suffering. Happiness is the successful state of life. Suffering is the warning signal of failure, of death. Just as the pleasure-pain mechanism and principle of man's body is an automatic indicator of his body's welfare or injury, a barometer of its basic alternative, life or death, so the emotional mechanism of man's consciousness is geared to perform the same function as a barometer that registers the same alternative by means of two basic emotions, joy or suffering. Emotions are the automatic results of man's value judgments integrated by his subconscious. Emotions are estimates of that which furthers man's values or threatens them, that which is for him or against him. Lightning calculators give him the sum of his profit or loss. But while the standard of value operating the physical pleasure-pain mechanism of man's body is automatic and innate, determined by the nature of his body, the standard of value operating his emotional mechanism is not. Since man has no automatic knowledge, he can have no automatic values. Since he has no innate ideas, as John Locke thought that we did, he can have no innate value judgments. But of course, man is born with an emotional mechanism, just as he is born with a cognitive mechanism. But at birth, both are tabula rasa. It is man's cognitive faculty, that of his mind, that determines the content of both. Man's emotional mechanism is like an electronic computer, which his mind has to program, and the programming consists of the values that his mind chooses. Think of the brain itself as the hardware, and that which is imputed into it as the software, or that which it is composed. But since the work of man's mind is not automatic, his values, like all his premises, are the product either of his thinking or of his evasions. Man chooses his values by a conscious process of thought, or accepts them by default, by subconscious associations, on faith, on someone's authority, by some form of social osmosis, or blind imitation. Emotions are produced by man's premises, held consciously or subconsciously, explicitly or implicitly. Man has no choice about his capacity to feel that something is good for him or evil, but what he will consider good or evil, what will give him joy or pain, what he will love or hate, desire or fear, depends on his standard of value. If he chooses irrational values, he switches his emotional mechanism from the role of his guardian to the role of his destroyer. The irrational is the impossible. It is that which contradicts the facts of reality. Facts cannot be altered by a wish, but they can destroy the wisher. If a man desires and pursues contradictions, if he wants to have his cake and eat it too, he disintegrates his consciousness. He turns his inner life into a civil war of blind forces engaged in dark, incoherent, pointless, meaningless conflicts, which incidentally is the inner state of most people at the present time today. Happiness is that state of consciousness which proceeds from the achievement of one's values. If a man values productive work, his happiness is the measure of his success in the service of his life. But if a man values destruction like a sadist, or self-torture like a masochist, or life beyond the grave like a mystic, or mindless kicks like the driver of a hot rod car, his alleged happiness is the measure of his success in the service of his own destruction. It must be added that the emotional state of all those irrationalists can not be properly designated as happiness or even as pleasure, since it is merely a moment's relief from their chronic state of terror. Neither life nor happiness can be achieved by the pursuit of irrational whims, Just as man is free to attempt to survive by any random means as a parasite, a moocher, or a looter, but not free to succeed at it beyond the range of the moment, so he is free to seek his happiness in any irrational fraud, any whim, any delusion, any mindless escape from reality, but not free to succeed at it beyond the range of the moment, nor to escape his consequences. I quote from Galt's speech: "Happiness is a state of non-contradictory joy, a joy without penalty or guilt, a joy that does not clash with any of your values and does not work for your own destruction. Happiness is possible only to a rational man, the man who desires nothing but rational goals, seeks nothing but rational values, and finds his joy in nothing but rational actions." The maintenance, therefore, of life and the pursuit of happiness are not two separate issues at stake. To hold one's own life as one's ultimate value and one's own happiness as one's highest purpose are two aspects of the same achievement. Existentially, the activity of pursuing rational goals is the activity of maintaining one's life. Psychologically speaking, its result, reward, and concomitant is an emotional state of happiness. It is by experiencing happiness that one's life, in any hour, year, or the whole of it. And when one experiences the kind of pure happiness that is an end in itself, the kind that makes one think, "This is worth living for," what one is greeting and affirming in emotional terms is the metaphysical fact that life is an end in itself. But the relationship of cause to effect cannot be reversed. It is only by accepting man's life as one's primary and by pursuing the rational values that it requires that one can achieve happiness, not by taking happiness as some undefined, irreducibly primary, and then attempting to live by its guidance. If you achieve that which is the good by a rational standard of value, it will necessarily make you happy, but that which makes you happy by some undefined emotional standard is not necessarily the good. To take whatever makes one happy as a guide to action means to be guided by nothing but one's emotional whims. Emotions, however, are not tools of cognition to be guided by whims, by desires whose source, nature, and meaning are that which one does not know. Is to turn oneself into a blind robot operating by unknowable demons, by one's stale evasions, a robot knocking its stagnant brains out against the walls of reality which it refuses to see. This is the fallacy inherent in hedonism, in any variant of ethical hedonism, personal or social, individual or collective. Happiness can properly be the purpose of ethics, but not the standard of ethics. The task of ethics, however, is to define man's proper code of values, and thus to give him the means of achieving happiness. To declare, as the ethical hedonists do, that the proper value is whatever gives you pleasure, is to declare that the proper value is whatever you happen to value, which is an act of intellectual and philosophical abdication, an act which merely proclaims the futility of ethics and invites all men to play it deuces while. The philosophers who attempted to devise an allegedly rational code of ethics gave mankind nothing but a choice of whims. The selfish pursuit of one's own whims, such as the ethics of Nietzsche, or selfless service to the whims of others, such as the ethics of Bentham, Mill, Comte, and of all social hedonists, whether they allowed man to include his own whims among the millions of others, or simply advised him to turn himself into a totally selfless person that seeks to be eaten by others. When a desire, regardless of its nature or cause, is taken as an ethical primary, and the gratification of any and all desires is taken as an ethical goal, such as the greatest happiness of the greatest number, men have no choice but to hate, fear, and fight one another, because their desires and their interests will necessarily clash. But if desire is the ethical standard, then one man's desire to produce and another man's desire to rob him have equal ethical validity. One man's desire to be free and another man's desire to be loved and admired for his virtues, and another man's desire to be undeserved love, another man's desire for undeserved love and unearned admiration have equal ethical validity. And if the frustration of any desire constitutes a sacrifice, then a man who owns an automobile and is robbed of that automobile is being sacrificed. But so is the man who wants or aspires to an automobile which the owner refuses to give him, and these two sacrifices have equal ethical status. If so, then man's only choice is to rob or to be robbed, to destroy or be destroyed, to sacrifice others to any desire of his own, or to sacrifice himself to any desire of others. Then man's only ethical alternative is to be a sadist or a masochist. The moral cannibalism of all hedonist and altruist doctrines lie in the premise that the happiness of one man necessitates the injury of another. Today, however, in our current modern society, in contemporary philosophy, most people hold this premise as an absolute not to be questioned. And when one speaks of man's right to exist for his own sake, for his own rational self-interest, most people assume automatically that this means his right to sacrifice others. But however, such an assumption is a confession of their own belief that to injure, enslave, rob, or murder other people is in man's self-interest, of course, which he must selflessly renounce. The idea that man's self-interest can be served only by a non-sacrificial relationship with others has never occurred to those humanitarian apostles of unselfishness who proclaim their desire to achieve the brotherhood of men. And it will not occur to them, or to anyone, so long as the concept rational is admitted from the context of values, desires, self-interest, and, of course, ethics. The objectivist ethics proudly advocates and upholds rational selfishness, which means the values required for man's survival qua man, which means the values required for human survival in general, not the values produced by the desires, the emotions, the aspirations, the feelings, the whims, or the needs of irrational brutes who have never outgrown the primordial practice of human sacrifices, have never discovered an industrial society, and can conceive of no self-interest but that of grabbing the loot of the moment. The objectivist ethics holds that human good does not require human sacrifices and cannot be achieved by the sacrifice of anyone to anyone. It holds, however, that the rational interests of men do not clash, that there is no conflict of interests among men who do not desire the unearned, who do not make sacrifices nor accept them, who deal with one another as traders, giving value for value. The principle of trade, however, is the only rational ethical principle for all human relationships, personal and social, private and public, spiritual and material. It is the principle of justice. A trader is a man who earns what he gets and does not give or take the undeserved. He does not treat men as masters or slaves, but as independent equals. He deals with men by means of a free, voluntary, unforced, uncoerced exchange, an exchange which benefits both parties by their own independent judgment. A trader does not expect to be paid for his defaults, only for his achievements. He does not switch to others the burden of his failures, and he does not mortgage his life into bondage to the failures of others. In spiritual issues, by spiritual, of course, I mean, pertaining to man's consciousness, the currency or medium of exchange is different, but the principle is the same. Love, friendship, respect, admiration are the emotional response of one man to the virtues of another, the spiritual payment given in exchange for the personal, the selfish pleasure which one man derives from the virtues of another man's character. Only a brute or an altruist would claim that the appreciation of another person's virtues is an act of selfishness or selflessness. Again, only a brute or an altruist would claim that the appreciation of another person's virtues is an act of selflessness. That as far as one's own selfish interest and pleasure are concerned, it makes no difference whether one deals with a genius or a fool, whether one meets a hero or a thug, whether one marries an ideal woman or a slut. Of course, I don't think maybe an ideal woman would be a slut, but in this particular case, Ayn Rand seems that this is not so. But in spiritual issues, a trader is a man who does not seek to be loved for his weaknesses or flaws, only for his virtues, and who does not grant his love to the weaknesses or the flaws of others, only to their virtues. To love is to value, Ayn Rand thinks, and so only a rationally selfish man, a man of self, is capable of love because he is the only man capable of holding firm, consistent, uncompromising, unbetrayed values. Of course, the man who does not value himself cannot value anything or anyone. And it is only on the basis of rational selfishness, on the basis of justice, that men can be fit to live together in a free, peaceful, prosperous, benevolent, rational society from a perpetual standpoint. Can man derive any personal benefit from living in a human society? Yes, if it is a human society. The two great values to be gained from social existence are knowledge and trade. Man is the only species that can transmit and expand his store of knowledge from generation to generation. The knowledge potentially available to man is greater than any one man could ever begin to acquire in his own lifespan. Every man gains an incalculable benefit from the knowledge discovered by others, indeed, indebted to the past. The second great benefit is the division of labor, which enables a man to devote his effort to a particular field of work and then to trade with others who specialize in other fields. And this form of cooperation allows all men and women who take part in it to achieve a greater knowledge, skill, and productive return on their effort than they ever could achieve if each had to produce everything that he or she needs on a desert island or on a self-sustaining farm. But these very benefits indicate, delimit, and define what kind of men can be of value to one another, and in what kind of society only rational, productive, independent men in a rational, productive, free society. Parasites, moochers, looters, brutes, and thugs, as well as cheaters, can be of no value to a human being, nor can he or she gain any benefit from living in a society geared to their needs, demands, and protection, a society that treats him or her as a sacrificial animal and penalizes him or her for their virtues in order to reward them for their vices, which means a society based on the ethics of altruism. And so, here I would say that probably Ayn Rand finds some conflict with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. No society, she thinks, can be of value to a man or woman's life if the price is the surrender of their right to their life. The basic political principle of the objectivist ethics, Rand says, is that no man or woman may initiate the use of physical force against others. No man or woman, for that matter, or group or society or government has the right to assume the role of a criminal and initiate the use of physical compulsion against any other. Humans have the right to use physical force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. The ethical principle involved is simple and clear-cut. It is the difference between murder and self-defense. Of course, a hold-up man seeks to gain a value, wealth, by killing his victim. The victim does not grow richer by killing a hold-up man. The principle is that no man may obtain any values from others by resorting to physical force or violence. The only proper moral purpose of a government indeed is to protect man's rights, which means to protect him from physical violence, to protect his right to his own life, to his own liberty, to his own property, and to the pursuit of his own happiness. And so here, I think Ayn Rand is probably thinking about the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes as well as that of John Locke. And without property rights, she says that no other rights are possible. She says that she would not attempt in a brief lecture to discuss the political theory of objectivism. And she said that those who are interested will find it presented in full detail in her book titled Atlas Shrugged. She says that only that every political system is based on and derived from a theory of ethics. And she also says that the objectivist ethics is the moral base that is needed by the politico-economic system, which today, in the present time, is being destroyed all over the world, destroyed precisely for lack of a moral, philosophical defense and validation. The original American system, that of capitalism. If it perishes, it will perish by default, undiscovered and unidentified, and that no other subject has ever been hidden by so many distortions, misconceptions, and misrepresentations. She says that today few people know what capitalism is, how it works, and what was its actual history. When she says capitalism, she means a full, pure, uncontrolled, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism, with a separation of state and economics in the same way and for the same reasons as the separation of state and church. A pure system of capitalism has never yet existed, she says, not even in America. Various degrees of government control had been undercutting and distorting it from the start, and that capitalism is not the system of the past, it is indeed the system of the future, if mankind and humanity in general is to have a future. For those who are interested in the history and the psychological causes of the philosopher's treason against capitalism, she says that she will mention that she discusses them in the title essay in her book Atlas Shrugged called For the New Intellectual. So she wrote a book called For the New Intellectual, which was published in 1961. These lectures are from the early 1960s. The present discussion has to be confined to the subject of ethics. She says that she has presented the barest essentials of her system, but that they are sufficient enough to indicate in what manner the objectivist ethics is the morality of life, as against the three major schools of ethical theory, the mystic, the social, the subjective, which have brought the world to its present state and which represent the morality of death. These three schools differ only in their method of approach, not in their content. In content, they are merely variants of altruism. The ethical theory of Immanuel Kant, which regards man as a sacrificial animal, which holds that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice or duty, in the words of Immanuel Kant, is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value. The differences occur only over the question of who is to be sacrificed to whom. Altruism holds death as the ultimate goal and standard of value, and it is logical that renunciation, resignation, self-denial, and every other form of suffering, including self-destruction, are the virtues that it advocates. And logically, these are the only things that the practitioners of altruism have achieved and are now achieving. Observe that these three schools of ethical theory are anti-life, not merely in content, but also in their method of approach. And indeed, she talks about these three schools, and she calls them the mystic, the social, and the subjective. The mystic theory of ethics is explicitly based on the premise that the standard of value of man's ethics is set beyond the grave by the laws or requirements of another, indeed a supernatural dimension, that ethics is impossible for man to practice, and that it is unsuited for and opposed to man's life on earth, and that man must take the blame for it and suffer through the whole of his earthly existence to atone for the guilt of being unable to practice the impracticable. The Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, for example, are the existential monument to this theory of ethics. And the social theory of ethics, she says, substitutes society for God. And although it claims that its chief concern is life on earth, it is not the life of man, not the life of an individual, but the life of a disembodied entity, the collective, which in relation to every individual consists of everybody except himself. I think what Ayn Rand is thinking here is the philosophy or the sociology of Monsieur Auguste Comte. And as far as the individual is concerned, his ethical duty is to be the selfless, voiceless, rightless slave of any need, claim, or demand asserted by others. The motto "dog eat dog," which is not applicable to capitalism nor to dogs, is applicable to the social theory of ethics. The existential monuments to this theory are, for example, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. The subjectivist theory of ethics is, strictly speaking, not a theory, she says, but a negation of ethics, and, of course, more, is a negation of reality, a negation not merely of man's existence, but of all existence in it of itself. Only the concept of a fluid, plastic, indeterminate, Heraclitean universe would permit anyone to think or to preach or proclaim that man needs no objective principles of action. That reality gives him a blank check on values, that anything he cares to pick as the good or of the evil will do, that a man's whim is a valid moral standard, and that the only question is how to get away with it. The existential monument to this theory is the present state of our culture, she says. It is not men's immortality that is responsible for the collapse that is now threatening to destroy the civilized world. But she says that the kind of moralities that men have been asked to practice, the responsibility belongs to the philosophers of altruism. She says that they have no cause to be shocked by the spectacle of their own success, and of course no right to damn human nature. Men have obeyed them and have brought their moral ideas or ideals into full reality. And again, she gives two examples, that of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, for the social theory of ethics, which substitutes society for God. And then she says that it is philosophy that sets men's goals and determines their course. It is only philosophy that can save them now. Today, she says that the world is facing a choice. If civilization is to survive, it is the altruist morality that men have to reject. And so she says that she would close with the words of John Galt, which she says I address as he did to all the moralists of altruism, past or present. Quote, "You have been using fear as your weapon and have been bringing death to man as his punishment for rejecting your morality. We offer him life as his reward for accepting ours." End quote. And that concludes Ayn Rand's The Objectivist Ethics and our series of lectures from Objectivist Epistemology, The Virtue of Selfishness and Capitalism. This comes from The Virtue of Selfishness, a series of lectures that were given in the early 1960s.